Good afternoon, one and all, and welcome back to the continuation of the Symposium on Ancient Egypt. This afternoon is the first of two presentations, and we have Dr. John Paul Stymick, the Dean of the Honors College here at Eastern, and certainly a well-known geography and geologist here to discuss with us more things. We find in each session there are things of reminder, and then there are things that most of us have no idea of or haven't thought of for a very long time. I know I was thinking in this morning's presentation about when was it that I learned some of these things, and I have to go back to the 6th grade social science class for some of it, which I'm like, that's pretty sad that, you go through 16 years of school, and when they were talking about important historical information, they were feeding it to 6th graders and 5th graders, thus the famous television show, of course. But to present the speaker, I will give you to Dr. Wabi.
Thank you. Welcome to this session of the Ancient Egyptian Symposium, A Futuristic Look Through Ancient Lenses. And here is a question for you that will introduce us to our speaker. Who comes first, landscape or people? Okay. Thanks. What did you say?
Didn't hear an answer yet.
The answer will come from here. People are born to a landscape that influences them, and they can change the landscape that influences them back.
Yes.
And here is Dr. John Stymick, Dean of the Honors College. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you all for attending this afternoon. I know you have other things that you could be doing this afternoon, but I do appreciate you taking time out from your busy schedule. Today I'd like to talk to you about the physical landscapes of ancient Egypt. During the introduction, the question was, which came first, the landscape or the people? And what I'd like to propose to you is that actually landscapes influence the people. Landscapes came first. And I was the former chair of the Department of Geology, Geography. I am by training a structural geologist. So I'm a little partial to the geology aspect. However, geography is going to be very important in this afternoon's talk. We'll talk about rivers, we'll talk about some geology, I can't get away from that. We'll also talk about some of the culture and some of the people of ancient Egypt. Let me just go back to that previous slide first. If you can see, let me see if I can turn off the lights a little here. Okay, that should bring out the slide a little bit better. This is just a satellite image. This is a MODIS. It's one of the platforms that NASA uses to image the Earth from space. This is just a MODIS image from space over central Egypt. Here you can see the Red Sea, Sinai Peninsula, Mediterranean Sea. The Nile Delta takes that very classic delta shape, hence the name for deltas where they enter large bodies of water. Nile River, this green stretch running down through eastern Egypt. And on both sides of the Nile, very barren landscape. You have large areas of open sand right through here, and mountain ranges in eastern Egypt and in the Sinai. Okay, we'll be focusing on that this afternoon. If you look at just a shaded relief map of Egypt and the surrounding area, this is just a representation of the topographic height or the elevation of the land surface. You can see a couple different things. Sea level is going to be this blue. Anything that's below sea level is going to be this very, very dark green, or it's going to be at sea level. So this area right here is known as the Qatar Depression. That's actually the lowest point in Africa. That's about 400 feet below sea level. So that's well below sea level. There actually have been studies and proposals to use this as a large inland basin for freshwater or for a viaduct from the Mediterranean. There are also some other depressions in the south of Egypt, and that's what I'll be focusing on here. Nile River. This large body of water right here is Lake Nasser. Okay, it begins at Aswan. The Aswan Dam was a project that built the dam in the mid to late 60s. It was a collaborative project between the Egyptian government and the former Soviet Union, the USSR. They built the dam to harness the water for hydroelectric power, but also to stop the annual floods of the Nile. And it was successful in both cases. As I said, I'll be focusing primarily in this southern part of Egypt this afternoon. Okay. Again, this is just a digital elevation model. It's a representation of the elevation of the topography in southern Egypt. So here you can see Aswan Dam. This is Lake Nasser in this light blue. Regions of high elevation, over 400 meters above sea level. Regions of low elevation, right here. Qatar Depression would be up in this region. Okay. This particular paper by Maxwell in 2010 focused on an area just to the north and west of the Nile River, which is actually lower in elevation than the Nile River. The proposal was that a lot of the area here had once flooded when the Nile River backed up. And there's a lot of evidence that supports that claim that this is really just an overflow basin that came through this wadi or this canyon. The Nile backed up into here. And so this became a large, we're talking very large, holding basin for the Nile River. And then it slowly drained. Once it got down to the sill level, or the level at which it can drain, this then became an isolated lake. That lake is going to be very important for the history of Egypt and her people. These are two models, computer-generated models, showing what the lake may have, where the lake may have extended during that early time period. Here's that wadi, or the inflow, outflow. Nile would have come here, backed up at one of the cataracts, backed up, flowed into here. If it backed up and filled the lake to this high lake stand at 247 meters above sea level, the lake would have been this large, over 68,000 square kilometers. This would have made it one of the largest lakes in the world, let alone in Africa. Slightly lower lake level at 190 meters above sea level still would have been a very sizable lake. There would have been connection all the way from the south of Egypt to central Egypt, going up into northern Egypt as well. Now the question is, why was this research done? This was done in 2010. The actual research was done in the late 90s, early 2000s. Why was this model done? We could do this using GIS, Geographic Information Sciences, anywhere in the world if we wanted to. Well, there were some lines of evidence that supported the fact that this used to be a lake basin, and that lake basin also supported early populations in the region. I'll step back for just a second. Right now, if you look at this part of Egypt, this is annual rainfall. So these are, you can think of them as lines of equal rainfall, isohyets. Okay? In this part of southwest Egypt, Egypt is outlined right here, this part of southwest Egypt, on average it gets 0 millimeters of rainfall per year. Even all the way into the north of Egypt, south of Cairo, it gets as little as 5 millimeters of rainfall a year. Egypt gets almost 100 millimeters of rainfall a year. all the way south near Khartoum in the Sudan, it gets 100 millimeters of rainfall a year. That's the current climate pattern, the current rainfall pattern. During the Pleistocene, anywhere between 1 million years ago and 500,000 years ago, this pattern was actually shifted. It was shifted to the north about 6 degrees, pressing two buttons at once, shifted to the north about 6 degrees. So this bullseye where it was getting zero rain was actually further to the north up here. This part of southern Egypt right here was receiving upwards of 100 millimeters of rainfall a year. That amount of rainfall allowed for agriculture to flourish, also allowed for grazing animals. So the early population from this region was able to harvest and cultivate cattle, sheep, and some of the cereal grains. This map shows some of the depressions. Okay, the Qatar Depression is located right up here. Depression I want to focus on this afternoon is this one, the Salima Depression in very southern Egypt. Some of the larger plateaus. And if you notice, the Nile River Valley is actually at the base of a plateau. It's in a valley. There's also this natural funnel through that wadi that I showed you on the previous digital elevation model, through the wadi into the Nile Valley and then down the Nile Valley. Pay particular attention to this location, Nabta. Okay, that's an actual important archaeological and astronomical site that I'll focus on in just a second. When this lake did drain, the natural funnel was to the east, was to the east and to the north. When the lake started to drain, when rainfall patterns started to shift, people followed water. Water is life. So they started to follow the water this way, towards the Nile. So the early people that were in this part of the world, anywhere between 100,000 and 50,000 and even 10,000 years ago, started to migrate towards the east and down the Nile Valley. There's Nabta. This is a location of a megalithic site. Other megalithic sites that you might be familiar with include Stonehenge. This is a site where early people arranged megaliths, large rocks, in a certain formation, and they used it for astronomical observations. They were able to predict, for example, the flooding of the Nile. I've got to stay away from that one button. Okay? They were able to predict the flooding of the Nile. They were also able to predict when the Nile would recede. That allowed them the opportunity to plant crops. This is one of the first of the agrarian societies to develop. It started about 6,800 years ago. Also at this site, early religious practices were developed. Here they started to raise and cultivate cattle and sheep, as I mentioned, and they also considered cattle to be their sacred animals. They actually had, at this site, sacrifices of cattle. So there were some ceremonial burial of cattle, both young and old. It tells archaeologists and anthropologists the importance that the people placed on, first of all, the cattle, but the significance that they would give up such a livestock, such a valuable piece of livestock to their gods. And so they were very, very concerned with and influenced by the flooding, the annual flooding of the Nile River. Cattle. One thing you think of when you think of cattle, especially wild cattle, are probably their horns. Okay? The horns of the early cattle were very important for protection of the cattle itself and protection of the people. People used the entire cattle. Well, the cattle also lended itself to the development of the early religious cults, if you will, in the region. People created deities that had cattle-like features. Here's Isis, the mother god for the Egyptian pantheon of gods and goddesses. And you can see the horns from cattle. She's typically depicted with the sun disk of Ra in the center. She is the mother god to the other gods and goddesses. So during this time, about 6,800, 7,000 years ago, people started to develop not only a domestication of wildlife, but also the ability to harvest grains, and they started to develop religious cults or identities. This is just a overall map of the Nile, starting very far south, all the way up north to the current Aswan Dam, then heading further north. The Nile is unusual. Just to give you a little history, the Nile is unusual. It's one of the most major rivers to flow north. It's one of the few of the rivers that flow north. There's probably only one or two other major rivers of the world that flow north. The Mackenzie in Alaska is one of them. But it does flow north. It goes through a series of cataracts or large gorges where the river will step down. So these are natural barriers to people trying to migrate up along the river, north along or south along the river in this case. Also, it's a natural barrier to people migrating south or downstream along the river. So you would actually have to get out, portage around that cataract or that gorge, and put your boat in and then go down again. So they're natural barriers. Other natural barriers that are found in the region, you have the western desert on the western edge of the Nile and to the south into Nubia or into Ethiopia. You have the eastern desert and a series of mountain ranges that I pointed out previously. You also have the Red Sea. And then you have the Mediterranean Sea to the north. So once people are situated in the Nile River Valley, they are very isolated. Normally that leads to it leads to a society that doesn't develop very readily because there's very little outside trade. However, in this particular case, it led to a society that flourished. There's a number of reasons for that. It's very protected. As I said, there were natural barriers on all four sides. You also had just a little trade north and south because you had to go with the winds to the south, or you had to deal with some of the cataracts if you were heading north along the Nile Valley. One of the other benefits just happened to be abundant natural resources along the Nile proper and in the mountains to the east. So even though they were isolated, they had their natural resources. There was abundant water. You also had very fertile land immediately adjacent to both sides of the Nile. Now, if you step away from that area, as you saw in the very first photo, barren landscape, desert, arid mountains. Okay, these are some of the natural resources found along the Nile. In the south, you have abundant gold deposits. Up in the mountain, you find tin, gold, amethyst. Also along the area, because of the mountainous terrain, you find lots of natural stone, granite, natron, alabaster, jasper, lots of limestone, basalts. All these are going to be very important to the Egyptian society, to the early Egyptian society. Each of these, especially the rocks, the granite, limestone, the basalt, all of these will weather at different rates and they have different colors. So it's very easy to assign different importances to them. Here's a brief, very brief history of Egypt from about 3100 BCE to about 525 BCE. So the pre-dynastic phase, before 3100, isolated city-states, not even city-states, maybe even towns along the Nile. During the Old Kingdom, you actually had a pharaoh that started to unite Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is upper relative to the Nile. So it's in the south of Egypt. You have Lower Egypt, which is lower along the Nile, which is in the north. So you had the first unification of Upper and Lower Egypt during this Old Kingdom. This is when you started to have the pyramids and large monuments being built. Middle Kingdom. I told you this area was an isolated region. It was isolated. To start this society, to start the Egyptian society, this isolation actually was a benefit. But once the society, once the culture started to build, it also was a problem. It was isolated in the sense that if there were any invaders, once they got into your region, it was very difficult to expel the invaders. So you started to see the invaders from the northeast, from, say, crossing over the Sinai Peninsula. As soon as those were expelled, at the end of the Middle Period, you had the New Kingdom. This is probably the part of ancient Egypt that you're most familiar with, the greatest pharaohs during the New Kingdom. You also saw invaders from the south. The Kush Empire started to develop along the Nile, but in Ethiopia, in Sudan, that region. So they also used this isolated region and the fact that the Nile was navigable going north, going downstream, to their advantage. So the Kush were able to invade from the south. You had the Assyrians from the northeast. You also had some people coming across the sea, primarily the Greeks and Romans. That was much later, though. So the Kush invaded the Upper Nile. They started to assimilate the Egyptian culture. Even to this day, if you're in the southern part of Egypt, they will refer to themselves as Nubians. They will not refer to themselves as Egyptians. They're typically more black African as opposed to northern African in terms of complexion, in terms of their ethnicity. They did adopt many of the Egyptian practices. This is one of the reasons why the unification during the Old Kingdom and then again the reunification during the New Kingdom was so successful. Those pharaohs adopted local practices, local religious practices. Any large empire that's very successful will do this as opposed to imposing their own practices. So the Roman Empire, the reason it was so successful in Europe, it adopted local practices and customs. It didn't try to impose everything from Roman. They knew that wouldn't work. This is primarily going to be about, or has been about so far, about the physical or geomorphic features that are important. So we've talked about some of the mountains. We've talked about the Nile River Valley. We can't ignore the deserts, the Western Desert and the Nubian Desert. You have a lot of what are known as depositional features in deserts. These are your typical sand dunes or your sand seas. When you see photos of Saudi Arabia, it's nothing but an ocean of sand. Same thing with Namibia in southern Africa. That is a sand sea or an erg. A lot of these terms come from those regions. So they're Arabic in their word history, or they are from North Africa or even South Africa. You also have what are known as erosional features. These could be where all the sand is blown out of a region and nothing but large pebbles or flat stones are left. These are typically called regs or sarirs. You may also have what are known as yardangs. These are yardangs. Okay? These are erosional features, and you have to remember, this is an area of high winds, lots of sand, and think of what happens if you leave your car out in a sandstorm. The paint's just abraded off, or if you're going to clean your car, you sandblast it. Same thing here. Here we have what used to be a large lake filled to at least this depth with mud. So you have mudstone right here. Then you had sandstorms coming through, starting to erode the mud, and it erodes it into these very unusual shapes. Some of these are huge. We're talking 20 meters. We're talking 65 feet tall. So these yardangs are very unusual. They lend themselves, possibly very easily, to ornamentation. This is the Sphinx outside Cairo, actually in the outskirts of Cairo right now, okay, near the Great Pyramid. This is probably a yardang. You can see sedimentary units in the back right here. So nice layered limestone. You can see a erosional channel right there. But the Egyptians wanted to decorate it. They added ornamentation to it. So they went ahead, added a headdress, a face, a nose, and they did this with fascia stone, some of the local stone that was in their area. So again, they started to use the natural resources, such as the white limestone. And here you can see some of the mud bricks that they used in the paws, in the front paws, or along the sides. And you can just make out where they actually carved some of the limestone here in the head of the yardang. You can actually see what are known as crossbeds. You can see how the limestone was laid down in a large lake or a river system. So even this naturally occurring feature, such as the yardang, was used by the Egyptians. They also made use of other local materials. Here we have a large pyramid. This is the step pyramid at Saqqara. This is under renovation. They didn't use the scaffolding like that. But the step pyramid itself is a large mound. It was a naturally occurring mound on the landscape. And the local inhabitants, to augment it, added mud bricks. And then elsewhere in the temple, here they used black granite on a series of cobra heads in the facade right here. So they used all these natural ingredients. Again, these resources were locally available. That's why the Egyptian empire and civilization was so well developed. It had everything it needed locally. Even the granites. This is at Aswan, near the Aswan Dam. This is the red granite that they started to make into an obelisk. They had it all cut out. They had the top pinnacle cut. And they started to cut along the sides, and a crack developed. So all their work was wasted. It's not like you could easily recut this. So they just left it. It's now a major tour site in that part of the country. As I said, there really is a juxtaposition of resources and lack of resources here in Egypt. You have what is essentially life, the Nile. And on both sides of the Nile, you have arid, barren landscape. In the background, you can see a large cliff. Now that cliff is limestones and sandstones, but it's very well bedded. In other words, it's laid down, layer upon layer, very well. Here you have a real nice deposit of mud. That characteristic sandstone, limestone, and then mud on top of it, and then it's repeated. That cyclical nature is very characteristic of a river flooding or a large lake deposit. So you can see where the current level of the Nile is here. That's about 60 meters, almost 200 feet up right there. So you can see how much the Nile has cut down into this. So this area, as little as 10,000 years ago, used to be a lake. Even in the town of Aswan in southern Egypt, you have that juxtaposition of very fertile, rich area. It's a very wealthy area. And then you have the desert in the background. As I said, they used local ingredients whenever possible. Here you have the sandstone in the background with a limestone facade. This is the temple at Edfu. Okay? So you have the temple in the background, some sandstone, maybe some limestone facade. You also had black granite that was imported. A little further away, the Hathor, right here, would be down here, very small. Okay, so this is the main entrance to the temple. And you can see the core of some of these walls and the core of this gate was out of this mud brick or mudstone. And then it was covered in the very fine sandstone or limestone that they could carve. This is a obelisk. This was found at the same location. This was actually on its side. I've rotated it up for you. Kind of was disconcerting when it was lying on its side. But this is just a red limestone. So you can see the Egyptians were very concerned with the aesthetics of their rocks as well. So they used all their resources to the full advantage. They realized that granite could take a very high polish, and they would polish it to a very high degree. Limestone, if you chose the right limestone, could also be very bright. So it's said that some of the pyramids at Giza were covered in a white, almost an alabaster white limestone. It could be seen from miles and miles away. This is a summary of both the climate and the culture of Egypt. And I want to bring it all together in these last couple slides as a summary to kind of emphasize how climate, geography, and culture are all tied together. You can't study one without the other, and they can impact one another as well. So here we just have the time scale on the left side. Okay, for the geologists in the audience, we have the Quaternary. Okay, so we're primarily in the Pleistocene and the Holocene. Okay, in terms of the culture, here we have the late Paleolithic, the Neolithic, the pre-dynastic. So this is before what you would consider the classic Egyptian society, the pharaohs. You had the Pharaonic kingdoms, then you had the Greeks and the Romans coming in, the Byzantines, the Islamic period, modern period would be right at the very top. This is what's happening in terms of in society. I don't know if you can make some of this out, but the sheep were introduced from Southeast Asia about 8,000 years ago. So that temple area, that megalithic site, was somewhere right in this area up to about here. This is where they started burying the cattle and honoring them and sacrificing them. At about 5,000 years, 5,000 to 4,000 years ago, there was this exodus. This exodus wasn't across the Red Sea. It was the exodus from the large lake area that I told you about at the very beginning. Because of the change in the climate, the monsoons moved to the south, which meant that large lake area started to dry up. If it dried up, you no longer had water. If you no longer had water, you no longer had life. So the people had to follow the water. They followed the water to the Nile. That exodus was during the pre-dynastic period. Okay? Right at the end of this, you started to get the Nile Valley population explosion. This is where you started to get the civilizations, the societies, merging into one large Egyptian society. On the right side, you can see what's happening paleoclimatically. So what's happening in terms of the weather and climate. Very arid down here. The lake started to fill. This is when the sheep were first introduced. You started to get the desertification or the aridification of the area. That's why the cattle, those very resource-intensive animals, were starting to be sacrificed. They were trying to appease the gods. The early god, for example, like Isis, were trying to be appeased here. They left that area, went into the Nile River Valley, still arid in that area, except along the Nile itself. You had the Old Kingdom collapsing. So not only did you have invaders from the north invading Egypt to end the Old Kingdom, you also had additional climate changes at that period. So you had additional climate change, then the climate started to get better. So you had the New Kingdom. Finally, you started to get invaders from across the sea. So you had the Greeks and the Romans. You also had the Kush Empire from the south coming in as well. This is a core. I want to just jump just a little. Here are the kingdoms on the left-hand side. This is a core, so not only can we find this out archaeologically through archaeological evidence and dating the archaeological sites, we can also find this out in terms of looking at the, in this particular case, ratios of two elements, titanium and aluminum, or strontium isotopic ratios in sediment cores. These are proxies for rain or temperature. So we can see how during the pre-dynastic time, high river flow, there was lots of water available. During the Old Kingdom, people moved into the Nile River Valley, declining flow. So they had to move into the Nile River Valley where the water was still present. The lakes were starting to dry up. Fluctuating flow, somewhere in the Middle Kingdom period. Finally, at the Old Kingdom, a little better flow, and then it started to decrease flow again at the end of the late period or the New Kingdom. So again, you can see how climate is driving the Egyptian civilization. You can also see how resources drove the Egyptian civilization to where it was. Okay, so in summary, this area was originally populated by tribes primarily from the south and the west. So from this part, this was a very fertile region at that period. Currently, this is the western desert. Not very fertile at all. Their success was tied to the availability of water, whether it was originally found in this area or later along the Nile River. That water, in turn, was tied to climate variability. So you can see how climate is actually driving the rise and fall of the Egyptian civilization. So it was directly tied to not only the natural resources, but to the natural boundaries. The current deserts, the sea, and the cataracts to the south. So you can see how all three things are intimately tied together. You didn't have just the development of the Egyptian civilization on its own. It was tied directly to the landscape, which was also tied to the climate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Typically, students report that if they are not really interested in geography and geology classes, it will be one of these classes, or two of these classes that you really wanted to get away with fast. But thanks, you made it very interesting. And
thank you very much.
Even for laymen, people. Any questions? I have two questions, so please jump in before me. I know Dr. Bonlu has questions.
That was a very eloquent presentation, John.
Say it again, please.
Oh. That was very eloquent presentation, an informative presentation. The climate at the present time, but all our advancement, does it still affect, especially I have been to Sinai Peninsula, and all the religion concept came because of base of the climate. Gods create disasters and back and forth in Sinai Peninsula. This still is affecting that area. You travel extensively that area. Is that right?
Yes, it is. It is. Modern man, if you want to say modern man, is trying to affect his environment by modifying the local environment. The Aswan Dam is a wonderful example. The Nile used to flood on a very regular yearly basis. And that was the basis for the red land, black land. The black land was the very fertile land of the river basin, of the floodplain, okay, along the Nile River. The Egyptians and the Soviet Union got together and decided, look, we don't want a yearly flood. It's like what happens along the Mississippi when we have too much rain or too much snowfall in the upper Midwest. You have these devastating floods. And it's a good thing. We are modifying it. The Egyptians modify it. You no longer have the yearly flood. But that means that if you want the agriculture to extend away from the Nile in either direction, or you want it to continue year-round rather than locally a very narrow strip, you have to start to put in irrigation canals and extensive irrigation canals. So where they used to be able to farm and cultivate land for maybe 10 kilometers on either side, where there's no longer the irrigation ditches, it's maybe 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers on either side of the Nile. So man does have a major influence on the local region. Also in the Sinai, especially in the Israeli portion of the Sinai, the Israelis are doing irrigation projects which are using all the local resources in terms of the water resources. So it's great for irrigation for that particular project or for that particular area, but it is having a negative or a detrimental effect elsewhere in the region. The Dead Sea has dropped 30 plus meters in the last 30 years. So what used to be a shoreline resort and spa is now 2 kilometers from the nearest part of the Dead Sea. It's creating underground solution pits and tunnels. So it's actually a hazard to walk in that area because of the cavernous nature of the below ground area. So yeah, man can have a huge effect on the environment.
More questions? Yes.
One of the charts towards the end that you showed,
Mhm.
that was very interesting, where you showed climate had changed over about 10,000 year period.
Yeah.
Yes, that one.
Mm-hmm.
I remember taking ancient Roman history class at SIU, and we talked about how the Romans were terrified when going after Pompey, Caesar going after Pompey,
Mhm.
1, and then 2, well actually, it's going to be 3. 2 was when Pompey's son, the pirates got together, and they had to go after him, and Antony had to stop him, and then when Octavian had to go after Antony, and one of the main reasons for all three was because of the abundance of the grain from Egypt. And I'm looking at this chart here, and I noticed by the time the Greco-Roman time periods, it wasn't as rich as it was earlier, which probably raised the prices up for the grain.
Yes.
More desperate to stop these, to get these people.
Yes, and so that's one of the reasons why the Greeks and the Romans wanted to trade with the Egyptians, to get access to those cereal fields, to those grain fields. And like you said, it was supply and demand. So in this case, climate had a huge effect on the supply, which made the demand by the emergent empire, the Roman Empire, that much greater.
You infer from this evidence that the Egyptians' culture and society was directly linked to the landscape that they lived in, the climate, the geography, and all of that. Do you think that could possibly also be true of the entire Earth as a whole?
Yes, yeah. This relationship between civilizations and water is found throughout history and throughout the world. So if you look at the Sumerian Babylonian civilization, it's in the Tigris Fertile Crescent. If you look at the Assyrian civilization, it's in the northern Tigris coming over into the Jordan area. If you look at the Egyptians, if you look at the Kush to the south, if you look at the, I forgot the group, in India, they're very closely tied to the river system. Same thing in China. Most of the major civilizations in the world and in history are tied very closely to the water. You can think of also the Greek system. The reason the Greek system was so well established and developed was the fact that you had water. It was a water-based trading society. And look at the British Empire. The reason they were so successful was because of the widespread water. Britain itself is a very, very small landmass, but they were so successful. The one society, if you will, or I won't say empire, possibly the United States. That would be the only one that would fly in the face of that argument.
Other questions or comments? I have a question. If you could bring a map, please, for us, where for the land of Egypt. Any map, I think.
You want a topographic?
Whatever. Yes, yes, this is good enough. When you mentioned that there is evidence of civilization, quote unquote, that
Yes.
lived here because of a lake or water and so forth, and they moved later on.
Yes.
Is there any evidence, to the best of your knowledge, that the other theory that says that civilization started from here, Sumerian, Mesopotamian, and civilization started this direction, not this direction? So is there any the history saying when did these people arrive here?
Yes, there is evidence to support the conclusion that people were down in this area about 10,000 BC. So this was after the Sumerians probably came out through the Assyrians. After, okay. Also, there is some evidence, and I'm not that versed in it, but there is some evidence that some civilization came along the north coast, North Africa, and then they came back down this way.
Okay.
So kind of migrated in this fashion. This area is the lowest part of Africa, especially North Africa. The development of the Sahara is intimately tied to the climate changes, and there were some areas over here where the Sahara wasn't as well developed. So there is some thought that there was migration along the north coast and then back down this way as well.
Okay.
But there are those two hypotheses, how the Nile River was populated, whether it was from the south or from the north.
Because the natural thing that these guys, if they are coming here, if this theory is correct, they will hit the fresh water first here, settle. Some of them will go around the course of the Nile, the water,
Yes.
following the water this
Yes.
way. And then they come here, whatever.
Yeah, there is that idea, and it is supported. It is supported because there are those small, I said not quite city-states, more town localities along the Nile, but it wasn't any large single civilization or society. It didn't become a, I know we have a sociologist in the audience, didn't become a society, at least in my mind. I'm using the term wrong, until it was coherent down here.
Yeah.
So those were much more isolated.
It wasn't a single state.
It wasn't a
country or a nation state.
Correct. It was more isolated, small little cities.
Tribal thing.
Tribal, yes.
Now, back to these guys, they settled here for how long, you think?
It's
100,000 years?
Well, it's estimated that they were probably in the region for about 2,000 years.
Okay.
So from about 6,800 to about 4,800 or 4,500 BC.
Now, they buried their dead, and
Yes.
they buried their cows. We
Yes.
found a cow here.
Yes.
That goes back to that time.
Yes.
If somebody goes archaeologically and start digging here, are we trying to find some human remains buried here?
Yes. More and more archaeological digs are going in that area because they are finding remnants of towns and villages or larger established campsites around the edge of the lake or up in this region as well. And it's not just here, but it's throughout the Sahara region. The more work that's being done on North Africa, on Egypt, Libya, the more they're finding there were extensive societies or groups in this area as well prior to the climate change.
How much truth in the fact that I read in an article that through the satellite imaging, they discovered that there were more freshwater lakes here, more agriculture at this now barren?
Yes, I agree wholly with that. There's a lot of evidence that supports that. The satellite imagery, where you can actually get the satellite radar imagery that penetrates many meters into the sand, and you can see old riverbeds, lake bottoms, things like that. In some areas you can see communities, especially when they're bringing ground penetrating radar into the region. You can actually see a development in the region.
Now please correct this statement for me that I recall from memory. They say now this is 95% desert, 5% agriculture. Back then, at one time, X time, it was the other way. It was 95% agriculture. It was like paradise.
Yes.
And then became barren.
Yes, and they think that transition from all green, the way it is on the map now, without being coated to elevation, but all green and very little barren space. They think that transition may have occurred in as little as 200 years.
Oh,
So climate change can change an area that quick.
that's quick.
Yes.
Okay. One more question. Anybody has any questions? I don't want to dominate this. Any questions here? So, another, this not discovery, but real thing, that there is a big water reservoir under this area.
Yes.
Where Libya is sucking water from here and having their big project for the green thing.
Yes.
Now, the presence of this big reservoir of fresh water here, any indications where did it come from? And this big amount is really big.
Let's see if I can. Okay. Here's Aswan Dam would be about, I guess, right here. Okay. So the southern border of Egypt would be maybe right there. Okay. This lake probably acted as the recharge site for that aquifer. And the regional geology, if you look at the aquifer and the dip of the porous beds, the sandstones and limestone, is in this direction. So it would act as the recharge site here, and then it would filter down into the aquifer and move in this direction to here, which would be under Libya.
Okay, allow me one more question. With the photo that you have, the sedimentation on the eastern side, do you have that picture?
Let's see.
There is where you said there is sedimentation.
Should be
Yes,
right
this
there.
one, this one.
Yeah.
Yes. When we said that it's evidence that this was a lake first and this is a deposit, do we have the extension of the continuation of the rim of the lake that resembles this around, or it's just disappeared?
In some areas, it's completely eroded, so we can't see where it formerly was. What's interesting about the Nile Valley, it is a basin, it is a valley, and it has since tilted. So the eastern side is raised up relative to the western side. So we can see what used to be below the water surface on the eastern side. The western side is much lower. That's been eroded, and the Nile is slowly moving to the east now.
And is it true that in the east side they believe that it is little blessed or less blessed, so they put their graveyards on the east side?
Yes.
Not
Yeah. Although the Egyptians, many of the funerary sites are on the west side.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's where the sun sets.
Yes.
Yeah.
So here is the.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Now, if you have more questions after you leave, email him. You have his email from the website. Email me or Dean Lanham. We'll be happy to answer your questions and put it on the website for the symposium after everything is said and done. So we'll have it documented for generations to come until they change the internet. Okay, now let us give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, one and all, and welcome back to the continuation of the Symposium on Ancient Egypt. This afternoon is the first of two presentations, and we have Dr. John Paul Stymick, the Dean of the Honors College here at Eastern, and certainly a well-known geographer and geologist here to discuss with us more things. We find in each session there are things of reminder, and then there are things that most of us have no idea of or haven't thought of for a very long time. I know I was thinking in this morning's presentation about when was it that I learned some of these things? And I have to go back to the 6th grade social science class for some of it, which I'm like, that's pretty sad that, you go through 16 years of school, and when they were talking about important historical information, they were feeding it to 6th graders and 5th graders. Thus the famous television show, of course. But to present the speaker, I will give you to Dr. Wabi.
Thank you. Welcome to this session of the Ancient Egyptian Symposium, a futuristic look through ancient lenses. And here is a question for you that will introduce us to our speaker. Who comes first, landscape or people? Okay. Thanks. What did you say?
Didn't hear an answer yet.
The answer will come from here. People are born to a landscape that influences them, and they can change the landscape that influences them back.
Yes.
And here is Dr. John Steinman, Dean of the Honors College. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you all for attending this afternoon. I know you have other things that you could be doing this afternoon, but I do appreciate you taking time out from your busy schedule. Today I'd like to talk to you about the physical landscapes of ancient Egypt. During the introduction, the question was, which came first, the landscape or the people? And what I'd like to propose to you is that actually landscapes influence the people. Landscapes came first. And I was the former chair of the Department of Geology-Geography. I am by training a structural geologist. So I'm a little partial to the geology aspect. However, geography is going to be very important in this afternoon's talk. We'll talk about rivers, we'll talk about some geology, I can't get away from that. We'll also talk about some of the culture and some of the people of ancient Egypt. Let me just go back to that previous slide first. If you can see, let me see if I can turn off the lights a little here. Okay, that should bring out the slide a little bit better. This is just a satellite image. This is a MODIS. It's one of the platforms that NASA uses to image the Earth from space. This is just a MODIS image from space over central Egypt. Here you can see the Red Sea, Sinai Peninsula, Mediterranean Sea. The Nile Delta takes that very classic delta shape, hence the name for deltas where they enter large bodies of water. Nile River, this green stretch running down through eastern Egypt. And on both sides of the Nile, very barren landscape. You have large areas of open sand right through here, and mountain ranges in eastern Egypt and in the Sinai. Okay? We'll be focusing on that this afternoon. If you look at just a shaded relief, again, this is just a digital elevation model. It's a representation of the elevation of the topography in southern Egypt. So here you can see Aswan Dam. This is Lake Nasser in this light blue. Regions of high elevation, over 400 meters above sea level. Regions of low elevation, right here. Katara Depression would be up in this region. Okay. This particular paper by Maxwell in 2010 focused on an area just to the north and west of the Nile River, which is actually lower in elevation than the Nile River. The proposal was that a lot of the area here had once flooded when the Nile River backed up. And there's a lot of evidence that supports that claim that this is really just an overflow basin that came through this wadi or this canyon. The Nile backed up into here. And so this became a large, we're talking very large, holding basin for the Nile River. And then it slowly drained. Once it got down to the sill level, or the level at which it can drain, this then became an isolated lake. That lake is going to be very important for the history of Egypt and her people. These are two models, computer-generated models, showing what the lake may have, where the lake may have extended map of Egypt and the surrounding area. This is just a representation of the topographic height, or the elevation of the land surface. You can see a couple different things. Sea level is going to be this blue. Anything that's below sea level is going to be this very, very dark green, or it's going to be at sea level. So this area right here is known as the Qatar Depression. That's actually the lowest point in Africa. That's about 400 feet below sea level. So that's well below sea level. There actually have been studies and proposals to use this as a large inland basin for freshwater or for a viaduct from the Mediterranean. There are also some other depressions in the south of Egypt, and that's what I'll be focusing on here. Nile River. This large body of water right here is Lake Nasser. Okay, it begins at Aswan. The Aswan Dam was a project that built the dam in the mid to late 60s. It was a collaborative project between the Egyptian government and the former Soviet Union, the USSR. They built the dam to harness the water for hydroelectric power, but also to stop the annual floods of the Nile. And it was successful in both cases. As I said, I'll be focusing primarily in this southern part of Egypt this afternoon.